Welcome to Novel Ideas, Chats with Local Authors. I'm Carolyn Luck, a Framingham author, and with us is our co-host, Josh Brogadir.
Great to be with you, Carol, as always. Thank you.
Josh, with all your experience as a reporter, middle school teacher at Walsh, right here in Framingham, a book narrator, and now you're an actor, we're really lucky to have you.
Well, thanks very much. And today's guest, author, of course, here, has written 2 New York Times bestsellers, grew up right here in Framingham. Welcome to Christopher Golden. He's written over 100 novels, screenplays, comic books. We're also very happy to have his mother, Roberta, here. Roberta, we want to talk to you, of course, about having Christopher as your son and any kinds of inspiration that you may have given him over the years. But we're really happy to have you here as well.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Chris, you gave a keynote speech at a writers' conference recently, and in it you said, quote, "We never really grow up, never really leave behind the children we were or forget the lessons we learned then, at least not for long." Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that? Or?
I think talking about that, it was at the Dallas-Fort Worth Writers Conference. I was establishing sort of both the good and the bad, the things you learn as a child. My mom really made an impression on us when we were kids to, play fair, to treat everybody the same, and but you also learn a lot of things when you see how other people behave. And so you never really leave those things behind, the good and the bad. And I think that we, as a society, we're still recovering from many of the things that earlier generations taught many of us, not my mom, of course. And I feel like we're at a place now where we should be growing up as a society. We should be beyond that at this point, and we should be moving. And I believe we are. I believe as I said in that speech, sort of the arc of our society is bending toward equality and justice and all of those things. And that's really what I'm talking about.
So a sense of wonder, a sense of creativity, I can imagine, Roberta. Tell us about Chris's childhood a little bit. Was this something that you saw coming, that he was going to be this kind of author with all these amazing ideas?
Well, when he got to be about 16, that came in. But before that, when he was very small, 3 maybe?
Oh.
3, 4?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
He used to come in with his brother into our bedroom, and there was a show at the time called...
7.
7?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I thought you were younger then, and still do.
I wish.
Anyway, they used to come in at midnight and watch Kolchak.
The Night
Kolchak, The Night Stalker, right. And from that, and they loved all of the other horror movies, or those monster movies, they loved them. And I let them... Creature feature, creature double feature. And so that's basically, they both liked all that kind of stuff. So instead of watching, the normal comics that you would put on for young children, and they were young, they watched these monster movies, and he liked it, and they both loved, his brother and he loved comic books, especially.
Yep.
And we used to go, that was always a reward for both of them. A quarter, that's how much they cost.
Or if we were sick.
Yes,
then
they would get a comic book.
My mom would go to the pharmacy or whatever and always come back with a stack of whatever comics that they had available.
So this is, he's always loved these stories, and as he grew up, then when he was, what were you, about 16 when you wrote that?
I think I was maybe 15-ish. Yeah, I wrote a story when I went to school at Marion High.
Nice.
And I had a teacher there named Lou Trudeau, and they had brought back briefly a school sort of journal kind of thing where you could write fiction, and I wrote a story for that one, and I don't even remember what it was called actually, and it was my first try. And he put it in the little journal, and that was a nice inspiration. And then actually, I wrote 2 more, what I consider my real first 2 short stories. And my mom had a friend who was an agent or whatever it was that
she was the producer of the show that I was telling you about on ABC. So she also did connections, I guess.
So on my behalf, which was great, she actually submitted the stories to Ellery Queen and Playboy and Alfred Hitchcock Magazine and a whole bunch of others. And while obviously they didn't sell, I got a lot of great rejections, meaning they were sort of forms, but most of them had notes written in the margins about, we can't take this, but we can't believe this kid is 15 years old, and tell him to keep going. So even though I didn't have a sale, it was in some ways better than a sale because it was motivation.
In addition to the movies that your mom mentioned, what kind of books did you read as a kid, in addition to comic books?
I read, I still read a wide variety of things. But when I was a kid, my favorite things, I loved The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, was one of my favorite books. And just because the characters were amazing. And I read about probably 40 Doc Savage novels. But aside from that stuff, what I mostly read was horror. I read a broader variety now, but I always say, and I mean it as profoundly as it sounds, that Stephen King was the narrative voice of my youth. His voice, where he talks to the constant reader and all of that, that sort of runs in the background of my head even now. And as a kid, I remember when Liam's Irish Tavern was here, right around the corner from here when I was a kid, I walked in, and the bouncer at the bottom of the stairs was reading The Dead Zone. It had come out in hardcover, and I was staring like, oh, I've got to get that. And I remember being in the 6th or 7th grade with...
when we went to his house?
No, we didn't go to his house.
To find it?
No, we didn't do that. Anyway, Sister Rena I went to St. Bridget's School, and the nun who taught me in the 6th grade, I was walking up the aisle during a period where we were reading, and I was reading Firestarter. Mm-hmm. And I remember her sort of pausing and sort of, what is that? And I showed her, and I think I remember later she talked to my mom about it, like, is this okay? But they were great. Sister Rena and Sister Maureen were really supportive. And when my first novel came out, and the first book is a little blasphemous, right. But they were actually super supportive. They loved it. They read it and were, so that's the stream of things.
Now, go ahead, Roberta, please.
No, I was just going to comment on his first book that he's talking about that was blasphemous.
Yeah.
Has a character named Peter Octavian,
That's the main character.
Who is a defrocked priest, right?
No, that was the bad guy.
Oh,
Octavian
okay.
is a vampire detective.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's where he starts with the religion in it, and those are great. That whole series is called...
She's my publicist.
Absolutely. Well, your mom should be your publicist, right?
It's a whole series of books with this one character that I really liked, and I still go back and read those sometimes. Okay,
well then that leads me to my next question, which is, number one, which is your favorite book that you've written? And I want to hear your mom's response to that, because it may not be the same. Let's find out.
It probably isn't. I go back and forth on my favorite, and I think that we need to be clear that the question of what my favorite is and which one I think is the best is that's two different questions.
Clearly, right.
I think my favorite is probably a novel called Strangewood, and that's because Strangewood I always think of as the novel in which I grew up as a writer. Because I went from I love the Peter Octavian books. They're hugely important to me as part of my career and who I am as a writer and all of that. But Strangewood is the book where I was talking about more adult concerns, things that were about real people and real characters. And in fact, it was sort of set up the sort of philosophy that I have approached most of those kind of supernatural books with my whole life, which is that I look at the supernatural as a catalyst. Because we all have things sort of running under the current of our daily lives, good things, bad things that that all they take to sort of come out as a trigger, and the supernatural provides that, puts us in an extreme circumstance, and
Roberto, what about you though?
I thought Strangewood was fantastic, and I know.
Well, what's your favorite?
I like Tin Men, which is current, but I love this book. Because it's so futuristic, besides being a fantasy sort of.
But did you like that because it's so different from the other stuff?
Yeah, I guess. It's it's really great. It's, you know, it's about robots that are carrying on a war, basically, for people, so that
soldiers don't have to go into battle.
that's right. So,
and then things go horribly wrong.
right. But I mean, there's a whole story in there too.
But if there's a through line in my work, it's always that things go horribly wrong.
Right.
But then they come out.
She hates when I tell this story, but I always tell it at every signing event. I always say,
Please.
When I was a kid,
Oh.
one time my mom said, "Why can't you write something good?" And by good, she meant, why can't I write something where, you know, the horrible things don't happen? And I said, look, I've written romantic stories and science fiction stories and Western stories. Somebody always dies. I mean, something goes horribly wrong. That's, you know.
But I loved his Strangewood that he spoke about. And I think that he's got his own life in there.
In Strangewood?
I do.
Let's hope not.
No, it's underneath. You know what I mean.
Okay. She always thinks that stuff is autobiographical. When sometimes it is.
Yeah.
But
Many times.
anyway.
Yeah, sort of the undercurrent in a lot of your stories, you kind of seem like you don't owe your reader a happy ending even, that the good guy doesn't always have to win.
I think in a full-length novel, you owe your reader at the very least a sense of justice.
Okay.
It may not be happy at the end. I mean, certainly it shouldn't be, look, if characters are going through something serious, then it's got to cost something. You know, you never get a clean win in life, and I'm not going to give it to you in fiction either. So I would like to think that the characters, that the reader finishes with a sense that there was some justice in the world of the book, but also, you know, it feels cheap if nobody loses. If the characters you're rooting for have come out victorious without having paid a price for that victory, it just feels cheap.
Let's jump into process for a moment here, and what this all takes. There are people at home who say, you know, I've had this idea in my head for so long, and you've heard that so many times at signings and whatnot. This is not something you just kind of fell into, clearly, but what is your process for getting started when you write one of these novels, or a graphic novel, whatever it might be, and how you get going, and take us through that? I
mean, I think if you go back to the very beginning, it was writing short stories and then realizing that if I could write 20 of them, I could write a novel. So that's the first thing. And the number one thing you have to remember always if you're trying to write is if you can't finish, you can't do it.
It's probably time for us to take a break.
Great.
So we'll come back and we'll delve a little bit into your book, Dead Ringers.
Great. Thank you
When
very
we
much.
return.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Morning, Gary. We are GetSchooled.com. You want a college education, don't you?
You know you do.
Yeah,
But I don't know where to start.
that's why we're here. We're free, handsome,
I think we're breathtaking.
and here to guide you through every step of the way, starting with attendance. Gary, financial aid forms. Biology homework, G. I got this. Is that brand? Colleges love extracurricular activities.
Chess really isn't my thing.
I got this. Doesn't matter. Go ahead. Picking a college, man. You and us. We go together like tacos and Tuesday.
And I love tacos.
Fire and ice.
Those don't really go together. Go to GetSchooled.com for more info.
Hey, you.
Yeah, you. Getting that college education, what are you gonna do? Graduate and take some office job? Be like everybody else?
Or will you dare do something different?
Like, be a teacher. You could be my teacher. You got the skills.
The smarts?
Yes, you. You could be the teacher I never forget.
That'd be cool.
Does that corporate job even have recess? What are you gonna make of yourself?
What are you gonna make of me?
And welcome back to Novel Ideas. We're here with author Christopher Golden, and this is his book, Dead Ringers. You're going to want to read it. We're going to talk about it right now in quite a bit of detail, but I need a little bit of a summary for people at home. Okay. Tell us what Dead Ringers is.
So Dead Ringers plays off of that idea that we all have a doppelganger or a double out there somewhere. But in this case, it also plays with the idea that, how you talk about living your best life. And I feel like no one is ever really living their best life. We try, some try more than others, but no one ever really is. And the idea sort of sprang up with the idea of what happens if your doppelgangers were out there and maybe they were living your best life in your place. And it goes on from there, and there's a ghost story element and some supernatural stuff. And the focus is on a divorced couple and sort of the friends around them and their daughter.
Yeah, I liked the setting part of this as well. Would you like, it's downtown Boston and it's a famous building?
Well, I do, I write, I've written stories set all different places all around the world, but it is very comfortable to come back and write about the Metro West and write about Boston and New England in general. And actually, interestingly enough, the scene that sort of opens the story is set outside One International Place, which is where my wife worked a number of years ago. She was a paralegal, and she worked right in that building, so it was familiar.
You mentioned a little bit about the darkness or the supernatural that comes into this. The Otis Harrison house is featured prominently in this, and the history is fantastic as part of this. It's not just present day, but we're going back. Tell us about that.
Well, I just flipped it for the book. It's actually the Harrison Otis house in real life, which is interesting because it really doesn't sound right. Harrison Otis doesn't sound, Otis Harrison sounds better.
It does.
So I fixed it for them, no charge. It's an interesting, I just wanted to look at Beacon Hill because the architecture there is so fascinating. And interestingly enough, even if you spent a lot of time in Boston, unless you do it by foot, you don't spend a lot of time up there. I worked in college, I worked at the State, not at the State House, but at the McCormick building behind the State House. Yeah. So I was up there a lot. And so it was interesting to me to see some of these buildings. And so I decided to take one of the classic buildings in Boston history and give it a slightly twisted, supernatural, maybe semi-demonic history.
Yeah. I'm generally not a person who's a big fan of horror and fantasy. I like to read books that are believable. So when I first picked this up, I thought to myself, am I going to make it through this one? Well, that was a stupid question. I opened the book and have a personal double, my sister, and it just so rang true. And there's been so many times when I've walked and seen somebody that I thought was someone else. So I got involved with Tess and this double, and I just was totally drawn right into this book. There was no way I was going to put it down. And I just love the sense that these characters are such real people. And I could then, by relating to the characters, get drawn into all the supernatural and all of the other stuff that happens.
Well, if you can't feel them, then their fate doesn't matter to you. And so you need to have a sense of reality. You need to have a sense that these are people that you could know. And that's always been so important to me in doing these things, because you need to be engaged. You need to be, it needs to matter to you. So.
You mentioned the divorced couple. Tess, Nick, can you read a little passage for us that kind of...
I'd love to do that.
Introduces essentially these characters.
Well, I know that Carol had a reaction to the opening moments here, so let's start with that. When Tess Devlin spotted her ex-husband Nick standing at the intersection of Oliver and High Street in the shadow of the curved glassy towers of International Place, her first thought was that he must have gotten a raise. His suit had the right cut, crisp lines, and a subtle pattern that suggested surprising confidence. It had been 2 months since she'd last seen him, and in that time he'd apparently shed 10 pounds and decided to tame his sometimes unruly hair. If she didn't know better, she'd have guessed he was one of the attorneys at Barr & Crow, the massive law firm inside One International Place. But she did know better. Nick taught archaeology at BU and couldn't have afforded this beautifully tailored suit on his best day. Their daughter, 6-year-old Maddie, had seen him every other weekend, but Tess and Nick had avoided each other during the handoffs, staring in their respective cars, pulling into driveways and beeping horns as if they were engaging in some kind of late-night drug deal instead of co-parenting their beautiful little girl. Now Nick waited at the crosswalk for the light to change. Tess thought about hanging back, avoiding contact, but she was a big girl. They hadn't ended well, but they had tried to put any animosity behind them for Maddie's sake. Tess stepped up beside him, smiling at him, even though he kept his gaze straight ahead. "Nice suit," she said. "You come into a fortune you didn't tell me about, or were you hiding it all along?" Several other people gathered at the curb, but the don't walk signal remained lit. Nick took out his cell phone and glanced at it, perhaps checking for text messages, either ignoring her completely or just profoundly distracted. He'd always had a touch of what had once been called Asperger's syndrome, and sometimes would just get lost in himself. In small doses, his difficulty with socialization and with reading people's facial and verbal cues was easily overlooked, but the little unintentional hurts built up over time and had contributed to the ruin of their marriage. "Yo, Devlin," she said, tapping his arm. Nick flinched away from her, holding his phone off to the left as if he thought she might try to steal it. He gave her a down-the-nose, slightly askance look that made her feel like some kind of freak, but he said not a word. The old scars on her flesh burned for a moment before the memory of them faded, but the pain in her left shoulder and her spine, that never faded. It lingered all day, every day, so familiar that sometimes she even forgot to feel the hurt of those old injuries. Nick had not caused the accident that left her with chronic pain, but he had never understood how it had taken up residence within her. Pain was the ghost that haunted her every waking moment. He wasn't really capable of empathy, but this? "Seriously?" Tess whispered. Nick might be her ex-husband, but even at their worst, he'd never given her this cold a shoulder. "What the hell is wrong with you?" For the first time, he swiveled his head to meet her gaze, brow knitted in a deep frown. "I'm not sure what your story is, but could you maybe go psycho on somebody else?" Tess gave a hollow laugh, hating the way her gut turned to stone. This shouldn't hurt so much, but it did. God damn him, it did. "Nick, come on," she said. "Why are you—" His frown deepened and his mouth twisted in a cynical huff. "I get it now. Nick, is it? Sorry to break it to you, but you need your eyes checked. The name's Theo. Whoever Nick is, I wish him luck."
I think that's great. You also have another variety of characters involved in here. There's an Indian person who's has a double, and you know, it's you've mentioned Nick with Asperger's, and we've just got such a mix of people. Speak to that a little bit.
Well, that's, we talked at the Open about the DFW Writers Conference, and the keynote I gave was called Writing for a Better World. And as I've gotten older, I felt like it's sort of incumbent upon us to try to bring more representation of different kinds of people into our fiction. And even if we can't know what other people's lives are, we can try to present them as people just like anybody else. And so we can try to at least respect other people's experiences. And so as I get older, I try to do more and more of being inclusive in the choice of characters, whether it be choice of their race or sexual preference, or having a condition like Asperger's syndrome, or having disabled people, whatever it may be. I just feel like the more that we see, we spend so much time in our entertainment seeing people who are just like us. And that's a privilege that we have, and we don't think about the fact that that's what we're seeing. I was so excited the other day. I'm off on a tangent here, but I was so excited. I grew up reading comics, and I just love comics. I was a Marvel kid, and I love all these Marvel Comics movies that are coming out now. And when I saw Captain America: Civil War, I was so excited to see Black Panther, and the fact that he is probably the best character in the movie was always one of my favorite characters. And I talked to a friend of mine the other day, and he said that his son, and they're white, and his son is so excited because he can't wait to be Black Panther for Halloween. And I thought, so not only are we now finally giving people an ability to see themselves in heroic roles, to see themselves as protagonists. It's not new, and I always say we're giving. I mean the whole world, not just we. Sure. But people have the ability to see them that way. There's a character called Ms. Marvel, who's a young Muslim girl in New Jersey, and she's a superhero and all this stuff. Anyway, the point is, not only can people of color and children see people like them in these roles now, but you have nothing strange in the mind of this 8 or 9-year-old kid about the fact that he is going to be Black Panther for Halloween. And to me, that's a triumph. You know, so that I think is what we should be going for in this, you know, as we go forward in entertainment.
Well, you find that in Dead Ringers, there's no question. The ensemble cast, the various ages and different groups represented. By the way, so this is coming out in paperback soon. I have the hardcover
Back
here.
in December, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And your next project is?
The next full-length novel is called Ararat, and it's due out, and my teachers at St. Bridget's in Marion would be so happy. But it's due out in April of next year,
okay.
And it involves Noah's Ark and demons.
Oh my.
Interesting. I like it.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
That sounds great. You also mentioned something to me that you're doing some research with some oceanography people or something.
Yeah, so I don't know when that book's going to come out. I'm not done with it yet.
Okay.
And it's going to be published under a pseudonym, but it'll be what they call a public pseudonym. I guess I'm not supposed to hide the fact that it's going to be written under a pseudonym. And it's called Shark Island. And I haven't talked about it at all yet. But it's been really, really fun to talk to scientists at Woods Hole, and I did the same thing on Ararat with talking to mountain climbers and things like that. And I love calling the scientists especially and saying, listen, I'm about to explain something to you that's total nonsense, and I need you to help me make it sound like it's not total nonsense. And invariably, to a person, always, it's they just laugh. They find it so amusing, and you'll get this, well, this is sort of impossible, that could never happen, although, and then they get to the point where like they're trying to help me figure out a way to make the thing that's really dumb not be dumb, like to make it seem plausible, and I have a blast with that.
Oh, that's great.
Well, listen, Christopher, thank you so much,
Yeah.
first of all,
My pleasure.
for being here.
Thank you both.
Oh, and we're delighted to have this program that allows us to celebrate some of our our local authors. And we're just so happy to have had you and Roberta here with us today. She must have been a real hoot to grow up with.
She still is. I'm not grown up.
And thank you so much for your perspective and hers as well. I'd like to thank the Framingham High School librarian because she did a window on local authors, and that's where I first saw this book.
I'd like to thank her.
And
So thank you very much.
so it's been fun to read.
Nice. And one of our next shows will feature Carrie Johnson. We're going to be talking about Hot Flash, her new thriller about a forensic firearms specialist and single mom who's determined to put Philadelphia's most vicious killer in lockdown for good.
Thank you, Josh. As usual, my fantastic co-host. And thank you folks all at Framingham Access TV for making this program possible. We've just had so much fun doing it. And I'd also like to, most of all, thank you, our viewers, for joining us for Novel Ideas. And we'll see you next time.